The topic for today is Sasanian Persia, with the provocative title of The Other Christian Empire. When we think of a Christian empire, we think of late antique Rome. Christianity became a tolerated religion in the Roman Empire and eventually became the only legal religion in the Roman Empire. The situation in Sasanian Persia was somewhat different, but it was nevertheless, it could nevertheless be considered a sort of alternative Christian empire, and I'm about to tell you why. So, first of all, Sasanian Persia. This is a map of the Near East. On the left, in sort of yellowish, in the yellowish color, and on the right, in the green color, you have the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, respectively, in about the year 600. Notably, there is no natural or even an artificial barrier that divides these two empires. On either side of the border running south from the Caucasus down into Arabia, you have the same sorts of people speaking the same languages and with the same religions on both sides. This border was accordingly fought over almost constantly. At many times it might have been difficult to determine on which side you were if you lived there. The Sasanian Dynasty came to power in about the years 224. Sasanian comes from the family name, or the putative family name, Sasan. And the first king of that dynasty was a man by the name of Ardashir, and this is him in a relief that he erected, receiving the ring of royal power from the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, and that's a gold coin, presumably an exact likeness of the first Sasanian king. More maps here. So, at the foundation of the Sasanian monarchy, it was a Zoroastrian monarchy, unambiguously. And we have these inscriptions like this that say, "This is His Mazda-worshipping Majesty Ardashir, King of Kings of Iran, whose descent is from the gods, the son of His Majesty King Pabag, the father of Ardashir." The idea of a Zoroastrian monarchy goes back a long way. This is the Achaemenid Behistun inscription of Darius the Great. Zoroastrianism was thought of as the an exclusively Iranian religion. You could not convert to it. It was considered sort of inseparably bound up with the idea of the Iranian monarchy, that it was a sort of ideological prop for it. And it has a kind of strange mythical component to, going back in the Avestan scriptures to the mysterious Arianam Vaejo, which means the abode of the Aryans. It's really debatable what that was, or whether it was a real place or not. Supposed place of origin of the Iranian people. And the Sasanian monarchy called itself Iran Shah, in imitation of Arianam Vaejo. Iran Shah means the empire of Iran, or possibly the empire of the Aryans, if you like. And there's this famous title, Shahan Shah Iran or An Iran, King of Kings of Iran and non-Iran. So you have the idea that the sort of monarchy that originates in the abode of the Aryans also lays claim to areas outside it. I suppose we could debate what this really means, but it sounds like, and it was interpreted as, a claim to universal jurisdiction at various different times. We also have insight into what the Zoroastrian royal religion was like, because a priest by the name of Kerdir, who was an exact contemporary, by the way, of the prophet Mani, put up an inscription in the late 3rd century, boasting of how he spread the Zoroastrian religion and persecuted everyone who wasn't connected with it, and destroyed idol houses and so forth. And he says things like, "The false teachings of Angra Mainyu and of the demons disappeared from the empire and were expelled, and the Jews, Buddhists, Brahmins, Nazarenes, Christians, Baptists, and Manichaeans were struck down. Their idols were destroyed, and the dwellings of the demons were annihilated and turned into places and seats of the gods." It's debatable whether this guy actually ended up destroying anything. I suspect that there's little archaeological evidence for a campaign of such radical destruction as is suggested here, but it still gives you an idea about the importance and the primacy of the Zoroastrian religion as a sort of ideology of state. So I've basically already said this, the idea of the Zoroastrian religion being at once a national, a religious, and a political identity. And this was there from the beginning of the Iranian monarchy. Now, I think at the beginning the Sasanians, with the exception of the persecutions of Kerdir, they probably didn't care very much about doctrine. I think that doctrine probably evolved slowly, as it did elsewhere. And there is little evidence of state-sponsored official persecution of religious minorities on a large scale until the Roman Empire officially adopts Christianity as the state religion. So this chap, Shapur II, part of his reign overlaps with that of Constantine, and he, in the midst of a war with Rome in the west, he unleashes what is remembered as a savage persecution. We have here from the writings of Afrahat. Some of you may have heard of this guy. He's writing a letter to one of his friends, and he notes that there was quite a severe persecution going on as he was writing. In later texts, mostly from the 5th century, the severity of this persecution is greatly exaggerated. So that, to me, that means that its effect was still felt, that it was a kind of cultural, I don't know what you would call it. It was an example of common suffering for a cultural group. Now, the persecutions suddenly stop in the year 410. In the year 410, does anyone know what happened in the year 410, by the way, in the West? The year 410 is the first fall of Rome. Does anyone remember why it fell, by the way? Germanic tribes being pushed out of the area in and around the Ukrainian steppe by another group of people. Anyone know who they were?
Those we know. The Huns.
The Huns, okay. So the Huns are ultimately responsible for the first fall of Rome, you could argue. I think someone also said that the Huns eventually moved and then displaced the Germanic tribes because of events that happened much earlier and further east in China. I think someone once wrote that Rome fell because the Chinese built a wall. So this is an example of that kind of history. So the Huns have moved further west, outside the sort of limits of China, and we know from Western history that they pose a very serious threat to Rome. But they also posed a very serious threat to Iran, and a branch of the Huns set up shop on the northeastern flank of the Iranian Empire, in and around what is now Afghanistan, or the sort of city of Balkh and its environs. the point that I'm trying to get at is that the invasion or the appearance of these nomads posed an equally grave threat to both empires, and it was a greater threat than either posed to the other. And therefore, a kind of rapprochement was necessary, and there is an edict that comes from the Persian king, which some have compared to the Edict of Milan, to the effect that Christians will no longer be persecuted. And that comes under the reign of Yasgard I. And he also summoned a church council, which met in the year 410, in imitation of a Roman emperor. And the decrees of this council still survive. And it's full of all sorts of interesting things. Some sort of mundane things like canons pertaining to church discipline or whatever. But there's also other stuff. His change of heart, the Zoroastrian king's change of heart, is explained with reference to the Proverbs. It says, "The king's heart is as a stream of water in the hands of the Lord, who can direct it whithersoever he will." Sort of an odd thing for a Zoroastrian government to produce. But he also says, "East and West are one dominion under my monarchy," implying that the Persian Zoroastrian king, who has now endorsed the Christian religion, is also laying claim to the jurisdiction which would have been covered by the Roman emperor. And I think, I don't know how to prove this, but I think it's not a coincidence that this happens in the same year that Rome falls, when it would have been possible to imagine the fall of Eastern Rome as well. Ties were not always so good after that, though. There's an incident of some tension still in the reign of Yasgard, and he sends an embassy to Constantinople, and we find this interesting quotation that the king is attempting to achieve some kind of reconciliation in order to achieve the tranquility and reconciliation of the two empires which constitute the mighty supports of the world. So, first we had the idea of a universal jurisdiction of a Zoroastrian king over both Zoroastrians and Christians in and outside the empire of Iran, as well as this other idea that the two sedentary states represent the sort of organs that bring order to the world outside the chaos and confusion brought by the Huns from the steppe. There's an interesting incident in which the Emperor Arcadius asked Yasgard I to adopt his son. Now, it's hard to tell whether this is... in any case, it never actually happened, but it's hard to determine whether it was actually mooted. Procopius, a writer of the age of Justinian, says that it was, and then Agathias, who comes a little bit later, says that only Procopius says that this happened, and he's inclined to doubt it. So, but I think maybe the fact that it was discussed at all, I think, is significant. And of course, that we then begin to find these strange stories that crop up here and there, that the Persian kings are interested in and possibly convert to Christianity. In the ecclesiastical history of Socrates, we find the first reference to Yasgard supposedly wanting to convert but dying before it can happen. I think that reposes on a genuine tradition whereby the king sort of put it about that he was interested in the religion in order to assure the loyalty of Iranian Christians. However, persecution came back. A cabal of Christians destroyed a fire temple, and several of them were put to death in the reign of Yasgard. And then the sort of groundswell demanding a persecution comes back, despite a happy resolution of that problem. If I recall correctly, one of the Christians who destroyed the shrine, said that he apologized for destroying the shrine, but he refused to rebuild it because he thought that rebuilding it would be no different than encouraging idolatry. So, and then I think Socrates, the historian, he says, yeah, that seems fair. The persecution that came afterward was savage, if we can believe our sources. It's mentioned by St. Augustine, believe it or not. He seems to think that it's proof that the church would suffer until doomsday. Cyril of Scythopolis claims that there was a campaign to hunt down and kill every Iranian Christian, which sounds probably a bit exaggerated. But we have independent corroboration for a very macabre fact that the Zoroastrian government had the bodies of buried Christians exhumed and had the bones thrown out of the earth. This seems strange, but it's in keeping with Zoroastrian ideas about not burying dead matter in the ground and so forth. And this would seem unbelievable, but it is corroborated into two independent sources. Trouble with Christianity and the Iranian government sort of continue into the 5th century. There are a couple of wars in the Caucasus in order to try to assure the loyalty of Armenian and Georgian Christians who were very much within the Iranian orbit, but also very close to Rome as well, since they had become Christians. But there's really no settlement or no amount of coercion or bribery or anything seems to work. And eventually, at the end of the 5th century, full tolerance is granted to Christianity of every sort within Iran. Famously, under the reign of Perroz and his immediate successor Baloch, Perroz dies in 484. There is not only full tolerance of every sort of Christianity, but the sort that is officially patronized by the royal house is Nestorian Christianity. Anyone have a theory as to why?
Yeah, because of the council condemning Nestorianism.
Right. So it's good to have the sort of the kind of Christianity that your main military opponent hates. It's good to have that kind, so that you can have another excuse to be in conflict. And that settlement basically is the way it is for the rest of Iranian history under the Sasanian Dynasty, with a couple of interesting exceptions. So this guy on the left here, that's Justinian, as I'm sure you know, is a genuine likeness of him. And on the right, these are the coins minted by Khosrow I, his great contemporary. Both were on the throne for a very long time. Justinian definitely built the Church of the Holy Wisdom. The arch at Ctesiphon may have been built by Khosrow I. If it's not him, it's roughly that same period, maybe by his grandson. Who knows? But the idea is you have these two superpowers sort of facing off against each other throughout the 6th century, with sort of advertising their might with monumental architecture and images of propaganda and so forth. And warfare begins to heat up again, almost from the very beginning of the 6th century. In the year 502, war breaks out. A couple of interesting things happen. The king Kavad, in the second year of his major war against Rome, he besieges and eventually conquers the city of Amida. But it's broadcast that he had a dream before the city fell that Christ had given the city over to him because of the sins of its inhabitants. And there's a famous scene where in the chronicle attributed to Zacharias of Mytilene, Kavad goes into the church in Amida and he's inspecting the icons, and he says, "Who's this?" The priest says, "Well, that's Jesus." And he says, that's the guy I saw in my dream. And he said, "Stay and receive from me the city and its inhabitants who sinned against me." Okay. I think that this is probably a genuine piece of propaganda, since it would justify the conquest of a Roman city by a Persian king in an area which was mostly Christian, which he intended to rule. And similar other details crop up. Oh, by the way, before I forget, this notion of competition and cooperation. As war continues throughout the 6th century, occasionally it stops and there are sort of armistices and so forth. And notably, in the year 562, we have an armistice and a treaty, and the treaty is one of the few that has survived intact in the history of Menander Protector. This is the first treaty that mentions religious minorities, and the Roman side demands that the Persian side fully respect and guarantee the religious freedom, as well as the rights of burial and graves for Iranian Christians, which is a kind of interesting corroboration for the details of persecution in the past. What this suggests is that the Christian minority is growing as well. In fact, Menander, at one point, there's a scene he describes where an Iranian ambassador appears at Constantinople, and the Persian king has deliberately sent an Iranian Christian, and he says, "If you attack Iran again, you'll find yourself at war with another nation of Christians, because Christianity is universal there," which is a curious fact. And at the same time, we find more legends. We had the legend about Kavad and the icon and the dream, and we find more stuff like that. Ardashir I is described as having converted to Christianity. And the story of his conversion is a sort of imitation of the conversion of King Goshtasp, the first Zoroastrian king. Zoroaster supposedly healed that king's horse, and in this case, an apostle of Jesus appears at the court of Ardashir, 300 years too late, but they weren't concerned about that. He appears at his court and heals the king's horse. And because of that miraculous healing, the king converts. We have a story of Khosrow I's Christian son, Anushzad, who mounts an unsuccessful rebellion and who dies the death of a martyr. The Shahnameh, the Persian national epic, narrates that in full and describes the mourning of the Christian community and the burial of this new saint. We also have the story in the Armenian historian Sebeos of the conversion and baptism of Khosrow I. And burial, conversion, baptism, death, and Christian burial of the Monophysite hero John of Ephesus has left a long history in which he describes Khosrow I as, in very sort of laudatory terms, and he says that he took an interest in all sorts of religions, but he thought that Christianity was the best one, and that he praised the scripture above all others. So let's just pause there for a second. I think that what this means, all of these stray notices I mentioned, I think that what they mean is that efforts are being made from the top, the Persian government, to make it possible for Iranian Christians to feel loyalty to a Zoroastrian monarchy, which would have been impossible if they had pressed very hard the idea of a distinctly Iranian religion and an exclusively Zoroastrian monarchy and nobility. It must mean that Christianity has penetrated to the highest levels of Sasanian society, that noble houses have begun to convert, or maybe some of them always had been Christian, who knows? But that it was now widespread enough that something had to be done to ensure that society, or at least the upper portions of it, would not fall apart. That's what I think it means. There's more. Hormazd IV, the son of Khosrow I, he says, apparently, according to a later Muslim tradition recorded by Tabari, he supposedly said to his assembled grandees, he said, "As our royal throne cannot stand upon its two front legs without its back legs, likewise our kingdom cannot stand or endure firmly if we arouse the hostility of the Christians and votaries of other religions whose beliefs differ from our own." I don't think that this is a later Muslim imagination of what a Zoroastrian Sasanian king would have said or done. I think that this is a genuine piece of historical material from the time. And the main reason for that is that in the rest of the Perso-Arabic tradition, Hormazd IV is universally hated. That you get the impression that certain people in the clergy or nobility felt that his sense of tolerance had gone too far. But again, this shows you how politically important a large constituency of Iranian Christians would have been. Now, we get to the really wild and weird part. Khosrow II, who is remembered as the great conqueror of the Roman Empire, who waged a war for almost 30 years and who supposedly destroyed Jerusalem and carried off the cross to give to his Christian wife, and who besieged Constantinople on two sides in league with the nomadic Avars, and who conquered Egypt and so forth. He allowed himself to be portrayed as a Christian proselyte and as a convert. Most famously, Pope Gregory the Great wrote a letter, which has survived, to a bishop, I believe, of Armenian origin named Domitian, whose great task had been to convert the Persian king when he appeared as a young man in Roman territory, fleeing a rebel who had deposed him after he took the throne. Pope Gregory seems to think that Khosrow II was this close to becoming a Christian, and he commiserates with Domitian, saying, I'm glad you tried your best. That you made every effort and so forth. We have Roman historians who say that Khosrow patronized the shrine of St. Sergius, a kind of martial saint. He gave the shrine a large gold and jewel-encrusted cross, and I think a paten of some kind. When his Christian wife was pregnant, his escape to Roman territory, fleeing the rebel, whose name was Bahram, by the way, his escape was orchestrated by Christian intermediaries, and this allows us to suppose that the Romans were more interested in helping him because he probably dangled the possibility of conversion in front of them. And the Chronicle of Fredegar is writing in distant Francia, he himself records that Khosrow converted to Christianity, which suggests that the rumor was so widespread and that Roman hopes were so attenuated that it reached as far as just the distant kingdom of the Franks. And we have independent corroboration for a project of building monasteries and churches at the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. The same same era. And we even find this sort of strange custom, I don't know if custom is the right word, a strange tendency of assimilating Zoroastrian and Christian ideas and Christian and Jewish patriarchs with Zoroastrian heroes of a deep past. In the Syriac Christian tradition, when Khosrow was doing battle with the usurper Bahram, when the Romans had come to back his bid for the throne, his victory is apparently assured by a vision of the Syrian holy man Sabri Shah, who appears beside his horse and promises him victory. In the Perso-Arabic tradition, exactly the same scene occurs, except instead of the holy man, it's the Zoroastrian angel Sorush, who makes exactly the same kind of promise and who rescues him from a tight spot. What I think this means is that you have an explanation, a similar explanation, with one key difference, directed at two different constituencies, to use political parlance. Otherwise, I don't know how we could possibly explain that. And there's sort of corroborating evidence for this kind of thing in another curious detail. In Susa, in southwestern Iran, there was a treasury, and inside it there was a kind of bronze container which supposedly held the body of the prophet Daniel. And this is actually reported in several unrelated sources. In the Armenian history of Sebeos, the anonymous Khuzistan chronicle in Syriac, and in the later Muslim traditions transmitted by Tabari. This box supposedly contains the body of Daniel. Christians venerate it as such, and Zoroastrians venerate it as the body of the mythical king Khosrow, and some as the king Darius III. So this sounds like the sort of thing that would have arisen at the level of folklore, but it's cropping up in sources that appear to be connected with the highest levels of government. The Roman emperor asks Khosrow II if he wouldn't mind handing over the body of Daniel. And Khosrow says, well, no, it's very important to my wife and to her Christian associates, so I can't give it to you. And this gets reported in the history of Sebeos. So a discussion at that high level about to me that suggests that this is a real exchange that actually happened, and that the myths associated with it, trying to sort of make it the focal point of two different religions. I think that's a genuine detail. Okay, we've already discussed the last war of antiquity. Okay, so I have this ominous slide called the New World Order. Let's take stock of what has been said. You've probably noticed that the sources for Sasanian history are kind of, they're diffuse and they're sort of, almost pointillist. That's just the way it is, unfortunately. We don't have the sort of long connected historical narratives like Procopius or Thucydides. We don't have that in Persian history, but we do have the sort of later Muslim traditions that seem to go back to some sort of dynastic history, and one of the most the most famous one is the Shahnameh. This is an English translation of it. This slide is alluding to the Arab conquest, incidentally. When the Arabs conquered Iran, and the last king died, he was on the run, trying to make his way into the steppe about the year 651. He was, according to legend, he was murdered by a miller. He took shelter in a mill. And this is the account of his death in the Shahnameh. So the poet says, when day followed night, he's just been killed by the miller. When day followed night, two religious ascetics came into view, and one of them approached the bank where the body had been thrown into a river by the mill. He saw the naked body floating there and ran horrified back to the monastery door where he had told the other monks what he had seen. The king is lying naked and drowned in the Zark mill pond, he said, and monks and priests came running from the monastery doors, crying out in grief for the king. One of them said, no one has ever seen such an event or heard of it, not from before the time of Jesus, that a wretched slave, a man of no account, should give a king hospitality and then murder him. May Mahui be accursed for this. Mahui is the governor of the area around which the king supposedly died. Alas for your head and crown and noble stature, for your heart and knowledge and wisdom. Alas for this scion of Ardashir and this young warlike knight. 4 monks stripped off their habits and went into the water. They dragged the body out of the young king, the descendant of Nushin and Ravan, to dry land, and everyone there, young and old, wept as they did so. In a garden, the monks built him a tomb that towered up to the clouds. They dried the dagger wound and treated the body with unguents, pitch, camphor, and musk, and they dressed it in yellow brocade, laid it on muslin, and placed a blue pall over it. Finally, a priest anointed the king's place with wine, musk, camphor, and rosewater. So that, according to a Muslim poet of the 11th century, is how the last king of the Sassanid line met his end, and the only people who were around to perform the funerary rites was a cabal of monks. So this is probably a legend. It's probably not really what happened. But this is written after the Arab conquest and after the fall of the Iranian monarchy, and it suggests that the idea of a Christian Iranian loyalist constituency is a real thing. That there really was a strong feeling of loyalty to the Persian Zoroastrian king amongst Iranian Christians, and that the propaganda that I showed you, or the myths, had worked, and that there was as much a feeling of unity between church and state in the Persian Empire as there was in the Roman. Now, I'll leave you with some final thoughts. This is a coin on the left. This is a coin of Khosrow II. Okay, this is a coin probably of the Caliph Abdul Malik, who built the Dome of the Rock. Although some have argued that this doesn't depict Abdul Malik, that it actually is supposed to be a likeness of the Prophet Muhammad. Either way, the coin is clearly derived from the Sasanian one, and that's meant to announce a kind of continuity, I guess. I don't know if you can see as well, there is a kind of looks like wings or feathers sticking out of the king's crown. And you can see exactly the same thing here. This is from the Dome of the Rock. And this is another thing from inside the Dome of the Rock. And of course, many people have tried to argue, with sometimes successfully, that the Arabian Empire after the fall of the Sasanian state was a kind of continuation of the Sassanid monarchy. And in some cases, as we can see, they consciously tried to imitate it. And the kind of more than ambivalent. It's not really ambivalent. It's kind of proximity between the rulers and Christianity carries on, at least in the early time. And we have this inscription from within the Dome of the Rock: "The Messiah will never scorn to be a servant of God, nor will the favored angels. Whoever scorns his service and is proud, all such will he assemble unto him. O God, bless your messenger and your servant Jesus, Son of Mary. Peace be upon him the day he was born, and the day he dies, and the day he shall be raised alive." Obviously a very different idea of what Christianity is like, but still you could argue that this relationship between church and state continued for at least a little while. Okay, that's the end.